Most of Europe has amnesia about 32,000 or so Iranians being murdered in 36 hours by the IRGC.
As President Trump prepares to meet Xi Jinping this week, with the U.S. declaring Iran's current proposal unacceptable.
We allow them to maintain power based on cooperation on oil, not cooperation on democracy.
The idea of arming people inside Iran, how realistic and how feasible do you think it is?
An air campaign to destroy a ground power and get some kind of significant change in the regime has always required an armed interventionist group on the ground.
How can the West support a secular democratic movement like the one centered around Prince Reza Pahlavi without it being dismissed as a foreign imposed transition?
If you don't punish the IRGC and strike them, they would just continue to do that to their population.
If you were speaking directly to the young generation of Iranians who are watching,
For a country like Iran, I hope we restore that kind of freedom, that freedom of choice, of opportunity, particularly to the young women in the country who I think more than anyone are deprived of that by the Iranian regime.
welcome back. We are joined by retired Admiral Mark Montgomery, Senior Director at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy and the Chief Architect of America's Modern Cyber Sovereignty, a commander who has navigated both the high seas and the highest corridors of power. He remains the definitive voice on integrated deterrence and the deconstruction of global threats. Admiral, it's an honor to have you on Beyond the Summit.
Thank you for having me, Amir.
Fantastic. You began your journey as a nuclear-trained officer and rose to lead Career Strike Group 5. Looking back, what was the specific moment or realization in your early career that shifted your perspective from managing a ship to architecting global strategy?
So that's a great question. I was very fortunate as a lieutenant commander, which is like a major in the Army, to be selected for the White House Fellows Program. And that is a program where you go work for a principal, cabinet member or senior White House official. And I happened to be selected to go work, selected for that program, which is mostly civilians, but every one or two military every year. And then within that, I was assigned to the National Security Council, working for the National Coordinator for Counterterrorism, a man named Richard Clark. And so working for Dick Clark for 3 years, I ended up staying another couple of years after my fellowship was up. And working for 3 years with him, I spent a lot of time in counterterrorism, weapons of mass destruction, critical infrastructure protection, cybersecurity, working those issues for him and inside the White House. And when you work there, this was a very small White House back in the Clinton administration and then the very beginning of the Bush administration. So you got to really see how power works in Washington. And then when it was over, I returned to go command a ship and went back to my Navy career for about 6 years or 7 years until I made Admiral, and then began to get into more strategy and policy positions again. So it was a very good introduction and apprenticeship in how power works in Washington.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. So that shift in perspective is vital today as President Trump prepares to meet Xi Jinping this week. With the U.S. declaring Iran's current proposal unacceptable, what do you believe is the hidden agenda regarding Iran at the table in Beijing? Do you expect that green light for further kinetic action to be the silent byproduct of this meeting?
So I suspect that kind of discussion would not directly occur, as you imply with the silent. I think probably Donald Trump will express his inclination, what he's thinking, and he might express a little frustration with Chinese support for Iran. He also might not. Trump tends to be a realist and doesn't really hold people accountable for what they do on things like that. But he also might say to him, look, your problem's not solving until my problem solves. In other words, your oil and natural gas and fertilizer is not getting here until everyone's problem is fixed. And which is to say that the U.S. blockade's not going anywhere. And that U.S. blockade is cutting off Iranian oil shipments to China. Now, China is not under duress from that yet over what it is doing, that the world economy is suffering, and then that causes China's economy to suffer when their trade partners suffer. So hopefully China will see the wisdom of leaning on Iran a little bit, but if they don't, I don't think President Trump would evaluate the success or failure of the summit based on that.
Right. Staying on China, as you mentioned, so regarding oil, they buy nearly 90% of Iran's oil. If the US resumes the strikes or tightens the blockade, does Beijing view Iran as a strategic asset worth protecting or as a convenient liability they're willing to trade for concession on Taiwan or trade tariffs?
So you're right that they take 90% of, or a very high percentage of China's shadow fleet fuel. But I'll also say that's still not a terrifically large percentage of Iran's imports. They have a massive strategic reserve for which they have not been that interested in doing releases from. They've talked about it, but not really done it. They also have a heavy reliance on coal, nuclear power, renewables on their grid. So again, there's not this direct corollary of of the blockade to significant current pain. But ironically, the other blockade, Iran's threats to damage merchant ships that causes few, if any, to transit through, that's having an effect on China's economy because that's all the other countries
Right.
in Asia, in Europe, who are going to have significant, who are going to have recessions or certainly perturbations in their GDP that make China's economy less robust throughout the year. So China's going to want this to get fixed. I just don't think they want to take a lead in getting it fixed.
So, we know that China is famous for being opportunistic, and they mainly, like to work behind the scene rather than speaking publicly. How do you think they're looking at Iran? As an ally, country that facilitates their objectives economically, or because of the geography? How do you think, China is realistically looking at Iran?
So I think they probably see him as a useful but expendable partner. Pretty much, they have a very, a very transactional relationship to everything. They were
Right.
transactional before Trump was transactional, and so when people tell me there's an axis of authoritarians, I agree there is. I think, for example, Ukraine is fighting Russia, but also North Korea, Iran, and China. But at the same time, China is a leading provider of one-way drones that serve as one-way attack drones and kill Russian soldiers. So China has no trouble bleeding Russia dry while they support Russia. Similarly, in Iran, there's value in pinning the Americans down in the Middle East. So supporting Iran has value to them. They won't expend any political effort, though, to position Iran better or defend Iran. I mean, they'll do simple things like vetoes in this, cost-free things like vetoes in the UN Security Council. But they won't do things that have an impact on their economy to support Iran.
So while we look at the Pacific, we are seeing the UK and France deploying significant naval assets to the region after the US and Israel have done the heavy lifting. Do you see this European surge as a meaningful strategic shift from NATO allies, or it's largely diplomatic show of force?
Yeah. So I'll say my definition is significant and the European definition is significant or different. I think the UK will be lucky to slog 2 ships down there. France will have a carrier strike group in the lightest sense of the word. Look, that's meaningful. It's helpful, but it's secondary. It could certainly, they neither have the capability nor the intent to open the Straits of Hormuz against this illegal action by Iran. They could support the United States in doing that. I don't think they will. What they're doing is showing up for the enforcement of some kind of peace in our time plan. In other words, once we've all agreed to not have any combat, their ships will show up. I mean, it's been extremely disappointing. One of the things we don't think about, when you only spend 2% of your GDP on defense for 30 years, the actual biggest losers are your navies. For the countries that had navies, it's the navies, because navies are large capital investments that 2% defense budgets don't support. So the Royal Navy is a shadow of its former self. The French Navy's still capable, but significantly, less capable than Europe needs. The Spanish Navy is actually reasonable because they bought American destroyers. They don't brag on that too much these days. But and all their people train in America. Again, I don't think the Spanish brag on that too much. But they're not willing to commit them even to this mission. I think this peace mission. So we'll have to see. So my take is that it'll be useful in monitoring a peace. It could have been effective in ensuring the transit passage of lawful merchant shipping through an international transit passage in accordance with the United Nations law on the sea, United Nations Convention on Law on the Sea. But these countries chose not to get involved. They looked at what Iran did and said, well. I mean, I guess from their point of view, it's okay for Iran to have control of the Straits of Hormuz, in contravention of hundreds of years of traditional maritime law, 50 years of 40 years of UNCLOS. So I'm very frustrated with them. And by the way, I'll take it one step further and say these two, most of Europe has amnesia about 32,000 or so Iranians being murdered in 36 hours by the IRGC. If any other country in the world had done this, I suspect the Europeans would be up in arms. But somehow, because the United States and Israel did something about it, it's not acceptable to acknowledge that and say that there's some righteousness in pushing back on the IRGC. And by the way, if you don't punish the IRGC and strike them, they would just continue to do that to their population. I mean, there's no one out there that can tell me, sanctions have had a mollifying effect on the clerical leadership of and the IRGC's performance over the last 7 years. So I'm extremely frustrated with both those countries.
I really appreciate you mentioning that because it's less than 48 hours, those many tens of thousands of people were killed and murdered on the streets, and they, mainly Europe, just they kept silence, and they did nothing. And even right now, I doubt that by sending these vessels, they actively get involved. Let's see, how it
No,
turned out.
they will not actively get involved. They will passively be involved.
Right. So whether it's a joint effort or led by the US, you've noted that we now operate at will within Iranian airspace. Beyond removing enriched uranium and the remaining missiles and drones arsenals, what are the strategic targets left that, if neutralized, would render the regime's military machine permanently obsolete?
I think you've named the ones for military targets, but clearly there are legitimate economic targets. And what I mean by that are dual use bridges, dual use power plants. I wouldn't advocate for striking anything that's singularly public health and safety or commercial sector only. There might be some more military or what we would call defense industrial base or legitimate military targets as well. But I think the vast majority of what I would call the strike, the deliberate strike planning list has been handled. There's probably a few targets left in that. Then there's obviously reattacks, particularly on missile stowage facilities where we did not achieve the results we wanted, or some of the nuclear stowage facilities. But I don't, I don't think there's near as many targets left as have already been serviced by the United States and Israeli aviation forces.
So there is a domestic dimension to this as well. In the January uprising that we talked about, so the regime uses snipers and machine guns, not drones. If their high-tech military power is decimated by external strikes, does it actually weaken the besieged security apparatus, or we dealing with two entirely different worlds of control? So they still have guns on the streets, they still can kill people, regardless of having drones or missiles. How this weakened militarily, can help people, when they get into the streets again.
Well, so listen, I would be an advocate for that kind of targeting plan if either the United States or Israel had armed the opposition. But an air campaign to destroy a ground power and get some kind of significant change in the regime has always required an armed interventionist group on the ground, whether it's Libya in 2011 or in 1999. The states had armed belligerents that we were supporting with our air plan. Without that, this is a very hard mission, and I think it's one that would be very challenging. And after a while, the collateral damage and civilian casualties would begin to rack up as you try to individually target the IRGC personnel in the absence of an armed intervention group. I don't know how the traditional Iranian military is going to approach a vastly weakened IRGC. At some point, they could take action. In theory, they have weapons. In practice, they don't have the ideological intent to do anything. I think they've been collecting paychecks and are comfortable. And are not willing to do the right thing for the people.
So did the Artesh or conventional army, there is not a huge difference, especially after the revolution. The recruitment process, is in a way that ideologically it's very similar to IRGC. They're not, very much different from each other in terms of, being loyal to the system. But you're right. Then when it comes to their paycheck, it can
Yeah, I
be a
don't think they're as
decisive factor.
wealthy. I don't think they've been exploiting the economy in the same way the IRGC. I mean, people don't understand the
Right,
IRGC,
right,
America, think about a mob family running a city. That's what you have, a separate security service that kills with impunity, collects money, stows it illegally in Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Cayman Islands, wherever. That, some of them are truly ideologically motivated, some are financially motivated. But yeah, to my I get that they and the Artesh, may have began in the same place, but the IRGC is much more committed to the status quo right now.
right. Right. So the idea of arming people inside Iran, how realistic and how feasible do you think it is? So because there is no existing organization apart from some minorities, I don't know logistically how doable it is.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I'm not sure how doable it was. It certainly got harder once you start the air campaign. Now everything's under a microscope. It's hard to, and there's always martial law in Iran, but there's really martial law in Iran right now in terms of movement or aggregation of people. So I think it would be very hard to do it now. That doesn't mean it wouldn't be hard to do it in the future. As we resolve this issue, both the nuclear program and the Straits of Hormuz and move forward. I don't, as easy as it would be for the United States to kind of take their eye off this issue, we have to keep our eye and our attention on it and look for the right opportunity to get the regime change we're not going to get in this air campaign.
At least I don't think, the current US administration wants to kick the can, on the road, for another couple of years. This might be, some faces have changed, but ideologically, systematically, structurally, they're the same, maybe even more hardline.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Trump administration has not shown a proclivity to push hardliners around. Just last week or so, where people are highlighting in Venezuela that the vast majority of political prisoners still haven't been released. We overthrew Maduro. You thought, well, at least the political prisoners would be released, and they're not because the United States doesn't make it a priority. We make getting their oil production rate going a priority, and we reward the former leaders like the vice president with we allow them to maintain power based on cooperation on oil, not cooperation on democracy.
That's true. Then the question is that what would happen to Iranian people who sacrificed so much in the last 47 years? It's been just suffering.
I agree.
Yeah, talking about neighboring countries, the concern, of course, is the neighborhood. Iran has repeatedly threatened the UAE and GCC neighbors in an era of integrated deterrence. How does the U.S. protect these allies practically?
It's a great question. I have to acknowledge that not all these countries are the same. The United Arab Emirates took a much harder
Hit.
pounding attack rates from Iran and defeated a very high percentage for a lot of reasons. And still were hit, still were impacted, still were damaged, but they kept their cool and their military performed well and they did well. They also have probably the longest standing beef with Iran outside the other GCCs, not longest standing, but most aggressive over control of some islands and claims to fields, although there are many multiple competing claims in the Gulf, the Iranian UAE claims. So from my perspective, UAE has done a fantastic job and the United States should partner closely with them. I think with some of the other states, the United States has got to recognize that those bases in those states like Bahrain and Kuwait were too close, and Qatar even are too close to Iran. We need to have some strategic depth, which means, we're going to have to work closely with Saudi Arabia because that's where the strategic depth is. And that's going to be a challenge, and potentially with Israel because there's
And
even
even Jordan, yeah.
there and maybe Jordan. So these are all options along the way. It's going to cost money and a lot of political will. So I have to see what happens over time. But I think that The United States also has to continue to cooperate through arms sales with all those countries, training opportunities, make sure that their equipment and personnel are up to snuff. And then we're going to have to maintain deployments there for some period of time. We currently have,
Do you see there would be a fundamental change of U.S. Military presence in the region?
not initially. So right now if there was a ceasefire and it was successful for 3 to 5 months, we'd probably draw down some of the Air Force fighter squadrons. So we have maybe 25% of our Air Force fighter squadron, some, reasonable number. There might be slightly lower than that now in the Middle East. If we keep them there too long, 12, 18, 24 months, it'll mean that we have a massive Air Force fighter readiness problem about 3 years from now. These problems take a little while to work their way through the system, but then, you know, the last time this happened, our fighter readiness dropped down to 33%, which meant, we couldn't respond to crises effectively. Same with the Navy ships, after being really deployed in the Gulf in 2013, 2014, we were unable to deploy a carrier in 2017, like 3 years later. So, and we have about 23, 24% of our carriers and 20% of our surface ships, destroyers and things like that in the Gulf. So these are meaningful numbers that will have to come down, but they won't come down, I think, for 3 to 6 months. And the aircraft can come down first. The ship's a little slower because it takes longer for the ships to come back. So you have to be really sure that you're done with them. So we'll have to see what happens on that, but that's a pretty big commitment for the United States. But the answer is yes, and it's going to have an impact on our ability to conduct operations, say, against China or Russia.
Absolutely. So now let's talk about securing Persian Gulf. If we secure Persian Gulf, there is still north, with Russia providing routes via the Caspian and ground path through Pakistan. How tight can this blockade actually get?
Well, the Russian one's interesting. Israel hit that path a few times during the 40 days of conflict. I think we could warn Russia and then hit it again, either us or Israel, and just say, look, we've told you not to do these shipping routes. We're going to sink every ship in the Caspian that does this. And they're pretty much defenseless against that. And, so hopefully you can pressure them into not doing it, but if they insist on doing it, then you can sink them. And after you sink one, I think the others will get the message, and you probably only have to sink one. But then, the Pakistan route, we have to talk with our Pakistani partners about that. But there'll be some through there. It's not going to be, we cannot cut Iran off from the world. We can just cut Iran from having large ships take oil to the rest of the world. And that's the kind of blockade we can do. I don't think we're going to shoot down civilian aircraft flying into Tehran from overseas, just for fear of it being a bunch of passengers.
Right.
So we'll be very careful with that.
Admiral, you're one of the few voices that I've seen, you're talking about Iranian people and day after what importance, the succession, and if the regime's grip does slip, we face the question of what follows. You've emphasized ensuring the next leader isn't a threat. How can the West support a secular democratic movement like the one centered around Prince Reza Pahlavi without it being dismissed as a foreign imposed transition?
First, I don't specifically support anyone, but I support the principles you're talking about, which is how do we get to a democratically selected leader who does not, as a due course, threaten the United States and Israel with extermination.
The reason that I mentioned
It's a
the
pretty low
name
bar,
of
by
Prince
the way.
Pahlavi because people are shouting his name, inside and outside the
Yeah.
country. He's got, a big follower as a
Yeah.
supporters, as a
And
leader of transition, at least. Yeah.
he may be the guy. I'm in no position to judge. But what I would say is that the Iranian people deserve better than they have. And, I do believe, I don't know that President Trump thinks too often about restoring democracy. I think he thinks about, removing threats from the United States, which is absolutely fine. That's, as president, that's what he ran on, and he does it.
Of course.
I tend to be more more thinking about what can we do to restore democracy, restore capitalism, restore the rule of law and transparency to countries. So a leader that you think can do that is a leader that I would hope to succeed there. And if that's the prince, then so be it. he does appear to have support outside the country.
You mentioned about U.S. How about West in general? Do they play any role, or they're willing to help, this transition or not, in your opinion?
So they can help with sanctions. So they can help both drive us into transition and out of transition with sanctions. It's not just passing sanctions, it's enforcing sanctions. And look, the United
Absolutely.
States is guilty of this as well. We don't do perfect in sanctions enforcement, we create challenges when we're insufficient or unsuccessful. But I think our European partners can help with that. I don't think they're going to help with anything else security wise initially. I mean, there's no there there. And there's certainly no there when you have to project 8,000 or 10,000 miles. It's just, this is one of those things we're starting to realize that almost nobody has in a way. Like, I think Israel has had a great Air Force, great demonstration. But if you told me Israel had to fly strikes in South America, I would say it's going to be a lot smaller because they only have a handful of refuelers. They're not going to get over there. You know what I mean? Same with Europe. They may have a bunch of F-35s up there, but they don't have the ability to sustain and operate them on a overseas deployment with ease. So as a result, I don't think much of Europe. I think that this is a Arab, U.S., Israeli problem to fix.
Since you talk about and care about people, I'm going to ask you this. If you were speaking directly to the young generation of Iranians who are watching their regime's military capability being dismantled in real time, what is the one high signal piece of strategic advice you would give them for the coming months?
Yeah, I think they need to maintain patience. That's going to be a tough month with the blockade in effect. That is absolutely eating up 95% of Iranian exports. So 17 billion, 20 billion a month. 350 to 400 billion a year of lost exports. And that's going to be tough. It's going to be tough on the Iranian people, good people and bad people. And so they just have to have patience and resilience to get through this while the United States brings a pressure clamp onto the IRGC.
Right. So, Admiral, is there anything that we haven't talked about, but you think it's absolutely crucial to pay attention to
Yeah.
or talk about right now?
Look, I think the United States needs to restart secure access, Project Freedom through the Straits of Hormuz, and we need to do it for three reasons. One, because it's an international waterway, and that's how international waterways are supposed to operate. And we've spent either 80 years or 250 years, depending how you count it, making damn sure international waterways are free. We may not have signed on to UNCLOS, the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, but we're one of the most aggressive enforcers of it. So that's number one. Number two, Iran can't be perceived as controlling the Straits of Hormuz at the end of this set of negotiations. They have to be physically demonstrated to be unable to stop the United States from both transiting with our own warships, but also dragging merchants back and forth through there. And number three, it'll relieve the pressure on the world economy so that they can remove the blinders from their eyes and see who is who here. Who is the revanchist authoritarian regime that killed 30,000 plus of its people in such a short period of time? Who's the authoritarian regime that for 47 years has pilfered the wealth of the state, enriched the accounts of the IRGC, and threatened its neighbors, conducted terrorism throughout the region? It's Iran. And you need to reveal that and expose that. And the way you get your allies and partners to do it is you remove the chokehold they have from the LNG, oil, and fertilizer that are stuck in the Gulf. So three advantages to continuing the operations for secure transit through the Gulf. And I think we need to do that alongside any negotiations.
Right. I love it. Admiral, we always end with this something personal. Beyond the treaties and military strikes, purely personal level, what does freedom mean to you?
Freedom is about opportunity. It is the opportunity to succeed. It encompasses speech and press and governance, but it's really about social mobility for individual, student or youth, that you are not confined to the economic status of your parents. You have the opportunity to move in society. through your own hard work, ingenuity, entrepreneurship. I think what we call the American dream is that's what embodies the American dream. Every country has their own dream. And so for a country like Iran, I hope we restore that kind of freedom, that freedom of choice, of opportunity, particularly to the young women in the country who I think even more than anyone have been, more than anyone are deprived of that by the Iranian regime.
Absolutely. Admiral Montgomery, thank you for providing the strategic clarity we need to see beyond this global crisis.
Thank you for having me, Amir. It was very good.
Thank you.